Hundreds of parents met with health officials who said tests showed no evidence of any environmental factors at the school.
Splashed. Mark bearing and range.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning into the Seedbutter channel tonight. In this video, I'll be examining the mass hysteria iceberg created by Walrus64. This iceberg is extremely well made and I encourage you to check it out as it's full of links where you can go learn more about each entry. There's truly some fascinating content to explore today, so sit back, relax, and get ready for your daily dose of mass psychogenic illness education. If this is your first time watching an iceberg video, the format is pretty simple. As we go into lower and lower tiers of the iceberg, the entries become more strange, dark, and obscure. So if you enjoy watching this video or content, please drop a like and hit the subscribe button to support the channel. With that over with, let's dive into mass hysteria. Mass hysteria refers to a plethora of different scenarios. The first use of the term mass hysteria refers to mass psychogenic illness, which occurs in very drastic situations. Mass psychogenic illness is an incredibly perplexing subject of the psychological and sociological world. With recorded observations of this illness dating back hundreds of years, there are plenty of fascinating and strange examples of it, each with one thing in common. They have zero biological basis or explanation. Disorders of this kind are called somatic symptom disorders, which, likewise, are one of the greatest mysteries of psychology. There are plenty of cases of somatic symptom disorders that are equally terrifying and fascinating, like people waking up one day to randomly lose control of a limb. With mass psychogenic illness, though, somehow there's a transmission of these symptoms, which, according to Wikipedia, can include symptoms such as dizziness, nausea, and even hyperventilation. Another thing mass hysteria can refer to is simply unfounded widespread panic. Widespread panic is a logical response to a perceived threat, and there's nothing medically invalid about that. This typically occurs when many people get information from one media source which incorrectly reports a threat or blows it out of proportion. Sometimes on this iceberg, mass hysteria just refers to conspiracy theories that have garnered a lot of attention. Mass hysteria can also refer to legitimate fear felt throughout a group of people, when they're all aware of a true impending threat. Now, the reason I say all this to you is because there are a lot of things that mass hysteria can refer to, so try not to keep a rigid definition of it in mind when you listen to these entries. Now, I also want to make it very clear that these distinctions are for entertainment purposes only, and these do not represent any valid medical research or opinion. Again, this is for entertainment only. There are plenty of theories about why mass hysteria occurs, though it's nearly impossible to study the subject with any certainty due to the difficulty in isolating variables. Many people believe it's associated with high stress and people feeding off of each other's panic and emotional distress, but again, we have no way of conducting a controlled experiment to learn more. But for some instances, there are explanations which can be even vastly more horrifying than that. Walrus64's iceberg goes over some very well-known and influential cases of mass hysteria, which are extremely interesting. Now that we're equipped with this background knowledge, let's get into the iceberg chart. This is the mass hysteria iceberg, explained. We'll kick off this iceberg with UFO sightings. UFOs, or unidentified flying objects, have been observed by humans for hundreds of years. This entry doesn't really refer to one specific sighting, but definitely throughout history, UFO sightings have caused some mass hysteria and widespread panic. This phenomenon probably peaked during the Cold War when fears of nuclear war throughout the world were at their highest. This is too big of a subject for me to get anywhere with in this video, so I'll go ahead and just move on. Our next entry, cryptids, refers to another broad category. Cryptids are creatures studied by cryptozoologists which have no scientific proof of existing, but their stories are often communicated through legends or tall tales. This entry doesn't refer to any specific case of mass hysteria, but this is an interesting subject that has panicked small communities, especially in North America, before. Many of these so-called sightings could be easily explained away by normal creature sightings, however. My favorite instance of a normal creature being mistaken for a cryptid is the Loveland frog. Turns out, This guy mistook an iguana without a tail for a frog monster. So when you think that people can't come up with cryptids based on real animal sightings, just remember that some guy mistook a lizard for a 4-foot tall frog. This entry refers to the clown sightings of 2016, which occurred mostly in the United States and Canada, first reported outside of Green Bay, Wisconsin. During this time, people would dress up as scary clowns and pose eerily in various places, notably schools. Usually these people would just attempt to get a scare out of any passerbys, but there were a few violent encounters during this time, such as a Florida family that was attacked by upwards of 20 of these clowns. There were also scattered reports of a clown purge that was supposed to happen on Halloween Eve of that year, though fortunately it never came to fruition. Around this time, there was a huge panic throughout different communities in America. Stores pulled clown masks from their shelves, schools banned clown costumes, McDonald's even temporarily stopped advertising with Ronald McDonald. And I kid you not, the president of the World Clown Association made an official statement condemning the trend. This was definitely a wild time. The Salem witch trials are one of the most well-known cases of mass hysteria in history, and I couldn't do the topic much justice in the short segment I have to talk about it today. But between 1692 and 93 in Salem, Massachusetts, a series of trials were held to determine whether certain members of the community were witches. Over 200 people were found guilty of being a witch, which resulted in 1 man being pressed to death and 19 being hanged. Funnily enough, none were burned at the stake. That was a myth that came afterwards. The phenomenon began in February of 1692, when Betty Paris and her cousin Abigail Williams, who were 9 and 11 years old, respectively, began to experience convulsions and fits, throw items around, make weird noises, and crawl under furniture. Soon later, a girl by the name of Anne Putnam exhibited similar episodes. As you might imagine, doctors could find no medical explanation of these behaviors, though a local doctor, William Griggs, pronounced the girls as having been bewitched. After this declaration, other girls in the village began exhibiting similar episodes. Under pressure from local authorities, some of the girls reluctantly placed blame on Tituba, an enslaved woman living in the community, as well as 2 other women as having bewitched them. These women were put on trial, during which the bewitched girls put their strange behaviors on full display. The story then follows a complicated and exhausting list of accusations, mostly motivated by family disputes and a desire to kill off people, mostly women, who were different one way or another. Now, I could describe this event in crazy further detail, though you probably have some familiarity with it, so I want to shift focus towards some potential explanations for the mass hysteria. There are a few medically based proposals which seek to explain what happened. The first is that there were great levels of stress in the community from ongoing attacks by Native Americans. This stress could have caused the young children to behave erratically, and the community members who were similarly stressed freaked out in response. My personal favorite explanation theorizes that rye bread eaten at the time was infected by the Clavipus purpura fungus. Geez, I totally butchered that pronunciation. And this fungus is what LSD is derived from. Another theory is that an episode of bird-borne encephalitis lethargica causing low levels of sleep made people more susceptible to quick anger. A more rational explanation is that once the trials got started, people just wanted attention or wanted to ruin the lives of others out of spite. As you might imagine, since this event happened hundreds of years ago, we don't have incredible data from it, but this is one of the most incredible instances of mass hysteria, and it's influenced the way we look at the condition today. Deno Senshi Porygon. Deno Senshi Porygon is the infamous Pokemon episode known for its epileptic seizure-inducing scenes. First broadcasted in Japan on December 16, 1997, it was watched on around 4.6 million TVs. During the episode, there's a scene which you can watch a slowed-down version of on Wikipedia, which actually induced seizures in some people. According to the same Wikipedia article, the flashes in the scene occurred at a rate of 12 Hz for about 6 seconds total. Soon after watching, viewers began to experience blurry vision, dizziness, nausea, and headaches, and these were the lucky ones. Others suffered seizures, passed out, or even experienced temporary blindness. And for this reason, I wouldn't exactly classify this as a typical case of mass hysteria because there is, in fact, a biological basis for this condition. For photosensitive individuals, when flashing lights are viewed rapidly, the brain responds excessively, and this can cause a seizure. This phenomenon isn't entirely understood, but researchers eventually will be able to narrow down a perfect medical explanation. So, how many people did this episode actually affect? According to Japan's Fire Defense Agency, 685 viewers were delivered to hospitals via ambulance. Later on, it was estimated that 5 to 10% of viewers experienced mild symptoms. The strangest part of this whole incident was that the number of people affected was far greater than the amount of people estimated to have been photosensitive. So this was affecting non-photosensitive individuals as well. Now, Nintendo was quick to apologize for the incident, though retailers removed Pokemon tapes from their shelves and shares of Nintendo stock fell about 3.2%. The anime went into a 4-month hiatus, and future guidelines for flashing images broadcasted in Japan were established. This caused a huge culture shock after it happened, and it had a huge effect on future cartoons as well. In the end, though, oddly enough, this event made the Pokemon TV series a whole lot more popular. War of the Worlds radio broadcast. War of the Worlds is a fantastic novel written by H.G. Wells in 1898. The plot follows an alien invasion of Earth, with the aliens destroying humans in their gigantic walking machines, which humanity has no capacity to fight against. Eventually, though, the aliens are miraculously killed off by bacteria. So with that background information, let me turn your attention to Orson Welles. Wells had a radio station show called Mercury Theater on the air, and in 1938 they performed a radio adaptation of The War of the Worlds. In this adaptation, they turned the novel into news bulletins describing the Martian invasion. Now, if this had been broadcasted today, anyone with a brain would be quick to realize this was a work of fiction, like many of the great analog horror projects we have today. But when people heard this on Halloween night in 1938, many took the news bulletins to be real, causing widespread national panic. Fear of alien invasion gripped Americans, and, well, no, not really. The idea of large nationwide panic gripping the nation after this broadcast has been exaggerated over the years. I also want to make the clarification that there weren't any medical symptoms displayed. This was just mass panic involving fear and wasn't really an outbreak of a disorder. Now, Wikipedia references a study that analyzed 2,000 letters to Wells and the FCC after the broadcast, and only about 27% of them came from frightened viewers. So this outbreak wasn't really as bad as history has drummed it up to be. One interesting thing, though, is that many people tuned in at different times and didn't think about aliens, but thought that the news bulletins documented an attack from the Germans. At the time, there were plenty of news outlets making ridiculously exaggerated claims, like that women were weeping in droves and men were stepping up to fight the Martian invaders, and reports of people being massacred. But this is a huge exaggeration. In truth, we'll never really get a full grasp on the situation that happened back in 1938, though we can say with certainty that reports at the time were greatly exaggerated and there wasn't as big of a panic from this instance that many people think. This topic has slid itself into the world of mass hysteria, though, and will be remembered as a fascinating case, regardless of whether or not the effects were smaller than most people think. Asteroid conspiracies. Naturally, this entry refers to plenty of different conspiracy theories, none of which really caused mass hysteria, though. If you do want to check out asteroid conspiracies, I'd recommend looking into the Jade Helm conspiracy and the Tunguska event. With that said, there's not much other information I can provide about this entry. The Great Toilet Paper Panic of 2020 describes a series of hoardings and panic buys, mostly by consumers in the United States, that occurred after American states and cities issued shelter-in-place orders. People, not knowing how long they would need to stay inside, bought up as much toilet paper as they could.
I just want one pack. No, not one pack.
This is just a case of widespread panic caused by consumer fear, though at the time, this was a pretty big deal. It was really hard to find toilet paper anywhere in the US. Black Friday is a shopping holiday that happens the day after Thanksgiving, where retailers have a ton of sales. Nowadays, many of these sales extend past or before the day itself, or even take place online, so it's not a huge deal as it once was, But throughout the past few decades, almost every year, there have been injuries and even deaths caused by overcrowdings and stampedings at various stores, usually in the United States. There's literally a website called BlackFridayDeathCount.com, which has a running total of all these deaths. Now, again, this isn't really a case of mass hysteria, but this would be more aptly titled a case of mob mentality, where people lose a sense of individual responsibility in a large crowd. But it's really sad that people are willing to abandon any sort of safety when there's deals on the line. The Satanic Panic was a time in the 1980s which has been described by author Peter Berbergall as a, quote, low-scale version of the McCarthy-era paranoia around communism. This panic was born out of the McMartin preschool trial, where the Los Angeles district attorney prosecuted members of the McMartin family over alleged abuses that occurred at their daycare. This trial would last 7 years, the longest and most expensive in American history, and it would result in 0 convictions. It began in 1983 when Judy Johnson, who had a child attending the daycare, reported to the police that her child had been abused by a daycare worker and by her estranged husband. She would go on to make many more claims, and made claims about what her child allegedly said, but sources go back and forth on whether or not her child actually confirmed any of this information. Now, it's perfectly reasonable that a child would confide in her mother about this sort of thing, and excellent that police would investigate it. But there's one small detail that was withheld from the jury during the trial. Judy Johnson had been diagnosed with acute paranoid schizophrenia and had actually been hospitalized for a time due to her condition. Not only that, but she was also a chronic alcoholic, which would eventually lead to complications that caused her death in 1986. She would later make claims to the police that one of the teachers accused during the trial had the ability to fly. So despite that she was not a reliable witness whatsoever, her information was still used in this trial. Parents were instructed by a packet handed out by the police to question their children about these alleged abuses, and many children would eventually be interviewed by a local abuse clinic. Some of these children were from different schools than the original school as well. Now, the questioning techniques that were used were experimental and very suggestive, meaning that the interviewing techniques often led the children to imagine and speculate on events even if they didn't happen. This poor questioning technique culminated in 360 children identified as having been abused. For the 7 years the trial lasted, a complex series of allegations, arrests, claims, and other bizarre phenomenon would occur, but that's a story for another time. The thing to note is that many of the children claimed they'd witnessed horrible things, literally including small animals being sacrificed on a church altar. The thing is, none of this really happened. But people ran with it and claimed that Satanism had infiltrated the world and that daycares were a particular target for Satanists to do harm to children. For that entire decade, the American public lived in fear of Satanism. Law enforcement routinely searched for Satanism where it didn't exist. Coercive psychologists and therapists sought to draw out false memories from children and other susceptible persons about experience with Satanism. Though the fear subsided, it never really disappeared and forever conditioned people to fear things that aren't really there. This is a giant case of mass hysteria based on sensational media, the failures of scientists and law enforcement, and it's all around a fascinating case. McCarthyism was a campaign in the United States during the 1950s carried out by Senator Joseph McCarthy. The campaign sought to oust communists living in the U.S., many of whom were academics, actors, or left-wing politicians. Those accused usually lost their job and reputation, and as you might imagine, many were falsely accused without any evidence. This is an example of widespread panic that happened during the Red Scare, where Americans feared communism so much and eventually thought it could spread from the inside. It's a very fascinating subject, and a good example of mass hysteria being created and going unchecked by the government. Y2K was a global phenomenon that derived from the way that computers represented years. Essentially, to save memory, computers would list the year date just by the last 2 numbers. So, for example, 1982 would be notated as 82. So when the year 2000 rolled around, computers would think it was 1900. This led to widespread anxiety over computers making mistakes that could cost billions. The transportation industry would lose their scheduling, banks would be unable to calculate interest, energy facilities with clock-based machineries would be threatened, The fear was so widespread that essentially anything with a clock built into it was thought to be at risk for failure. In the end, it wasn't that bad. The great problems that were thought to happen included things like cash registers not working. That was basically the worst of it. Ironically, the countries that invested in preventing Y2K ended up paying more money than the countries who just ignored it and fixed things afterwards. There was widespread panic from this, but it was certainly blown out of proportion. The 2012 phenomenon is a set of beliefs deriving from the Mayans that the world would end on December 21st, 2012. This was due to the fact that the Mesoamerican long count calendar, which describes an over 5,000 year cycle, which was used by many groups, most notably the Mayans, ended on that date. Many people living in modern-day nations where the Mayans once held influence truly believed the world would end, as did many New Age cults and groups. These people theorized that the Earth would be destroyed by some astronomical phenomenon like a planetary collision. These theories were labeled as baloney by the scientific community, and rightfully so, since the last time I checked, the Earth is still here, but sadly, this event had a huge effect on people. More people than expected actually believed the world would end, and one person was confirmed to have committed with many similar cases reported. Crazy behavior was displayed all over the world, even in places not related to Mesoamerica. In China, for example, a man influenced by the impending apocalypse wounded 23 children with a knife, and 1,000 members of the Christian cult Almighty God claimed that it was necessary to overthrow communism because of the world ending. As tragic as this was, it could have been much worse. There were many proposals for mass suicides, and in one instance, the Argentinian government actually had to close down a mountain due to a proposed group suicide there. The Great Fear refers to a time right before the French Revolution where a general panic was felt throughout peasants of the land. With a low crop yield that year and rumors of a plot by the upper class to starve out many workers, tons of peasants attacked French manors and other properties owned by aristocrats. Now, it's not really psychogenic illness due to the fact that peasant oppression is a legitimate cause for retaliation, though some historians speculate that with the low crop yield, many peasants turned to eating molded bread that had ergot inside, which causes hallucinations. This would have contributed to the general unrest and fear, and thoughts of a great conspiracy. In the end, there was no famine conspiracy created by the aristocrats, though the French Revolution did soon commence. The strawberries with sugar virus is one of the most fascinating entries on this iceberg today. Strawberries with Sugar, or Morangos com Açúcar, is a Portuguese teen drama show. It was mainly shown in Portugal and Brazil. In 2006, an episode followed a group of teens encountering a life-threatening virus. After the show aired, 300 kids across 14 schools in Portugal began to show similar symptoms to what was presented in the show, including rashes, difficulty breathing, and dizziness. Schools were temporarily closed in response to this perceived outbreak, but eventually the Portuguese National Institute for Medical Emergency dismissed the illness as mass hysteria. Now, this is a fantastic example of how susceptible the human brain and body is to outside influence, even that which can cause illness without any biological reason. I mean, these kids literally watched a TV show where people got sick and then displayed symptoms of the exact same virus. That's insane. Charlie Charlie was a challenge that took social media by storm around 2015. An evolution of the Spanish game Juego de la Lapicera, or pencil game, Charlie Charlie involved balancing pencils on top of one another so that the top one would move and point to a space on a piece of paper where someone would write answers to questions like yes or no. Now, allegedly, this pencil would get moved by spiritual influence. Now, as you can imagine, there are legitimate explanations such as small air movements and players on the game vibrating the surface slightly that would actually cause the pencil to move. Now, this wasn't necessarily mass hysteria as much as it was just a social phenomenon, because the idea of this actually being caused by ghosts was quickly debunked. The Hawaii ballistic missile incident is an entry that truly, truly moves me. Take yourself back to 2018 for a moment.
A new missile launched being called a breakthrough, a successful test of an intercontinental ballistic missile, possibly capable of reaching Alaska.
Tension between the United States and North Korea was high, and with the Hermit Nation conducting more and more missile tests, the U.S. became concerned that there was a slight possibility that a North Korean missile attack at Hawaii was feasible. Then, at 8:07 in the morning of January 13th, 2018, Hawaiian citizens received this message on their phones.
The U.S. Pacific Command has detected a missile threat to Hawaii. A missile may impact on land or sea within minutes. This is not a drill. If you are indoors, stay indoors. If you are outdoors, seek immediate shelter in a building. This is not a drill.
For many, taking shelter was impossible, and death was imminent. The only thing to do now was to send messages to loved ones and prepare for the worst. Now, fortunately, the message was quickly followed up with multiple agencies confirming that there was no missile attack. All was well, and all that came out of this was that Hawaii's emergency management administrator stepped down. But for the first few minutes after this message, everyone was gripped by panic. Panic gripped everyone in Hawaii. The dancing plague of 1518 was an outbreak of people spontaneously dancing in modern-day France. It began in July of that year when a woman began to dance uncontrollably in a street in Strasbourg. More and more people joined in, and the town authorities eventually set up a band and brought in professional dancers, believing that there was an epidemic of overheated blood that would sort itself out if people had a chance to dance. But it lasted all the way until September. Allegedly, upwards of 15 people a day were killed dancing from heart attacks, exhaustions, or other medical reasons, but this is heavily disputed. No one really knows why this happened, but contemporary explanations either include mass psychogenic illness or another case from poisoning by bread contaminated with ergot. The Momo Challenge was an alleged challenge on the internet where the character Momo would try and convince young people to commit suicide. Momo herself was a sculpture created by the Japanese special effects company Link Factory, but her creepy nature caused her to spread throughout the internet like wildfire. Some particularly disgusting individuals did create a video where Momo would instruct children on how to hurt themselves, but this wasn't a widespread thing, and these videos came out after the hoax was alleged. In many countries around the world, there were some unconfirmed deaths related to this challenge, but in reality, this was just a hoax spread by fear in the media. Astroworld 2021 was the recent Astroworld music festival hosted by rapper Travis Scott. On the first night of the festival, November 5th, there was a surge in the extremely overpacked and unsafe crowd that resulted in the death of 9 concertgoers and the injury of hundreds more. I really can't stress how unsafe the amount of people in one packed area was. Whoever planned this and sold the number of tickets they did given the small space had no consideration for human life. One of the scariest parts of this incident is that multiple security officials had been begged to stop the show as people started to get hurt, and they didn't for quite a while. Amid the chaos and confusion, some crazy things happened, including Travis Scott not stopping the show while literally looking at someone who had just gotten killed, or who was nearly killed, as you can see in this photo. It's clear that both the rapper and the planners of this event possess some share of blame from this tragedy, and there are a huge number of lawsuits being filed as we speak. To all those affected by this tragedy, I wish you the best in healing. As far as this entry's role in this iceberg, the reactions of the panicked crowd could be considered mass hysteria, but it's important to recognize that those victims were acting how anyone else would have if they were stuck in that horrible situation. The Hammersmith ghost murder case refers to an 1804 trial in the UK that established the precedent that one could be held accountable to illegal actions even if they were under a mistaken belief. This will make more sense once you hear what happened in this entry. In the Hammersmith area of London, people began to report ghost sightings. The ghost was believed to have been a suicide victim from the year prior. Feeding off of each other's panic, more and more people began reporting normal and explainable situations as ghost sightings. As the tensions rose, armed patrols were set up, which Officer Francis Smith was a part of. Armed with a shotgun, he spotted a bricklayer named Thomas Millwood, who was wearing white clothes. Believing the bricklayer to be a ghost, Smith shot and killed the man. And what followed after was the city reconciling with their hysteria in a trial that set a precedent for future generations. This entry shows how mass hysteria and unquestioned panic can lead to disastrous consequences. The June bug epidemic occurred in 1962 at an American textile factory. Word had spread of bugs that arrived via a shipment of fabric that were spreading a deadly disease. 62 employees reported symptoms, many of whom actually had to take time off work. Some were even taken to the hospital. The symptoms in question included numbness, nausea, dizziness, and vomiting. Company and government physicians soon stepped in to investigate, and while they initially thought bugs were the cause of this illness, they couldn't find bites on anyone affected. They soon came to the conclusion that an incidence of mass psychogenic illness could have taken place, and started to look for more psychological explanations for the occurrence. Sure enough, they found that among the infected employees, nearly all of them had reported extreme levels of stress from working at the factory, which had just been opened and was apparently very disorganized. While we'll never have a full explanation of what happened that day, it's clear that media sensationalization, high emotions, and stress manifested themselves into an epidemic that for some felt very, very real. The 1983 West Bank fainting epidemic, which occurred in March and April of, you guessed it, 1983, involved a large number of Palestinians fainting, ultimately leading to 943 hospitalizations. Now, right when this started, both the Israeli and Palestinian authorities rushed to claim that the other side was using some sort of gas on these Palestinian civilians. The Palestinians claimed that the Israelis were trying to attack civilians, and Israelis claimed that a Palestinian group was using gas to incite riots. To this day, it isn't 100% clear if some sort of gas or irritant was used in the beginning, but nearly all of the cases of fainting were concluded to be psychosomatic, or not based on biological explanations, but rather psychological ones. This is a very interesting example for many reasons, but in particular, it shows how quickly that psychosomatic illness can lead to political conflict and violence. This is a very interesting example for many reasons, but in particular, it shows how quickly psychosomatic illness can lead to political conflict and potentially violence. The Afghanistan poisoning hysteria is another interesting example of mass hysteria, like the previous entry, had some political ramifications at the time. Starting in 2009, over the course of a few years, there were outbreaks of mass psychogenic illness in various schools for girls across Afghanistan, resulting in the WHO confirming 1,632 cases from 22 schools, though fortunately no deaths were reported. These girls actually experienced symptoms of poisoning, and many people quickly assumed that the Taliban were responsible. Though, after some investigation, the position of the WHO and many other authorities is that this is an example of mass psychogenic illness, potentially due to the stress experienced by women attending schools in Afghanistan, as there are many extremists opposed to women's education who do their best to make said women in the region feel unsafe. Now, it was hard to make this distinction, though, as the Taliban are known to have attacked schools and oppressed women in terrible ways, but oddly enough, these cases were all psychosomatic. So, as you can tell from the title, this entry refers to multiple incidents of mass hysteria in Nepal, and the ones I looked into all took place at remote schools in the region. I'll be linking a couple of research papers here so you can read them if you're curious, but these cases are all related to children, typically young girls, experiencing strange behavior related in part to spirits. In one case I read, the mass hysteria began when a 9-year-old girl began to complain of abdomen pain and a headache, and then began to roll around on the floor saying that she saw a lady in white. After seeing her, other students joined in. These cases are very interesting, and while again they have no concrete explanation, they demonstrate how mass hysteria can spread and how children in school are just as susceptible as adults are in the workplace. The Miracle of the Sun is an extremely interesting entry if you enjoy Christian and Catholic studies in particular. The Miracle of the Sun, or in Portuguese, Milagre del Sol, occurred on October 13, 1917, after 3 children who claimed to have seen the Virgin Mary claimed that a miracle would occur that day. So, around 40,000 people gathered in Fatima, Portugal, and stared up at the sky waiting for a miracle. For some, it came. Some people reported that the sun spun around or zigzagged across the sky. Some saw radiant colors careening across the sky, and others felt that their clothes dried off in an instant. Many people, however, saw nothing, and scientists speculate that the reason people made such claims is because they stared into the sun for too long. While I would not advise trying this yourself, it's very reasonable to assume that if you look into the sun for a while, your eyes would eventually start to see movement or colors that weren't actually there, purely because you're burning up your eyes. The Catholic Church investigated the incident, and the results remain controversial to this day. Pope Pius XII claimed that he saw the event from the Vatican Gardens. The most likely explanation for this is that people saw different things from staring into the sun and fed off of each other's emotions to believe that a miracle was performed. But regardless, the story is an awesome read, and there's a lot I didn't cover here, so if you need a rabbit hole to dive into, consider this one. Next on our list is the case of meowing nuns. So a particular theme from this research that you've probably picked up on is that high stress amongst a group of people can facilitate the spread of mass hysteria. With that in mind, consider the job of a nun during the Middle Ages. Many women were forced into the job against their will and had to spend their life in celibacy performing hard labor. The resulting stress of this may have caused covenants of nuns in the 15th century Germany and France to start acting like cats, biting, scratching, and meowing. And the first case happened in France, where nearly an entire covenant of nuns meowed non-stop until they were threatened to be beaten by a group of soldiers. This is certainly one of the weirdest set of symptoms on this list, but it goes to show how long-term stress can impact the likelihood of one catching psychosomatic illness. This entry is a classic. Dihydrogen monoxide is a molecule which has the capacity to kill humans if consumed in enough quantities. In fact, it's been confirmed that everyone who consumes this molecule will, at some point, die. Have you ever heard of this before? Dihydrogen monoxide is actually water, but this chemical name is unfamiliar to most people, and many people have done pranks using this name. People would get on radio shows and make claims that dihydrogen monoxide had entered the water system and that people should stay away from it. Obviously, it's not a real danger, but in some instances, it was presented in ways that made people freak out. Now, it never really led to mass hysteria, but it was still pretty interesting, and you can check out some of the popular instances of dihydrogen monoxide pranks here at Wikipedia. While the Pendle witch trials are dwarfed in popularity compared to the Salem witch trials, they were a very similar phenomenon that occurred in England in 1612. 11 people were accused of witchcraft, and 10 would be executed. Just like the Salem witch trials, these executions had less to do with witchcraft and more to do with rivalries and social status, but this set of trials was much less sensational. I won't focus on it too much because the situation is very similar to the witch trials I already covered, but I'll link you to the wiki so you can have a better read if you'd like. In Halifax, England, 1938, many people in the city, especially women, suffered attacks from an unknown man who came to be called the Halifax Slasher. So many people were reporting that they were attacked by knife or razor that both police and vigilantes started patrolling the city. Many mistaken slashers were beat up, and eventually one man, Percy Waddington, who had reported an attack by mallet, admitted that he made the whole story up. Soon after, multiple others confessed that they had also lied, and 5 of these people would actually be arrested for public mischief offenses. Scotland Yard would eventually conclude that there was, in fact, no slasher. Now, this is a particularly interesting case because affected people underwent plenty of conscious actions. I mean, they had to both create a story and then go through the trouble of reporting it to the police, all from mass hysteria. This entry perfectly depicts how far and how deep mass hysteria can infiltrate the mind. Rather than just simple behaviors that wouldn't have much meaning, people in this situation were so swept up by mass hysteria that they actually did things that had real-life consequences. Spring-Heeled Jack is the name of a cryptid that appears in English folklore from the Victorian era. The first claimed sighting of him occurred around 1837, and from then on, sightings occurred very frequently, especially around London. Though there were differing reports of what he looked like, his appearance was frequently categorized by clawed hands and red eyes. In 1838, the Lord Mayor of London at the time was reluctantly forced to recognize Spring-Heeled Jack's existence, as numerous reports kept coming in. More and more Londoners began to report this cryptid, the most famous cases being teenage girls Lucy Scales and Jane Aslop, who both reported that Spring Heel Jack had attacked them. This story took the media by storm, gripping the city of London. The large number of sightings wouldn't end until the 1870s, but as you might imagine, there was never any definitive proof of Spring-Heeled Jack's existence. The Belgian Coca-Cola crisis of 1999 was a group of health complaints across 5 Belgian schools. Students complained of headache, dizziness, nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, diarrhea, and trembling, which all began when 26 students at a school fell sick, blaming it on the Coke they drank. Coca-Cola was quick to pull local drinks from shelves. Now, after this quick recall, it should have all ended there, but we're on layer 4, so you know it's going to get weirder. A local news outlet reported that Coke was responsible for the illness, and after this broadcast, more and more children from the same and different Belgian schools began to fall ill as well. Belgian health authorities temporarily banned the sale of Coke while hundreds and hundreds of people reported symptoms. Health officials could find nothing wrong with the Coke, but Coca-Cola themselves said they identified the culprit: low concentrations of hydrogen sulfide in the glass bottles given to the school. But this wasn't nearly toxic enough to make anyone experience the symptoms they had. External toxicologists couldn't find anything wrong with the soda. Regardless, Coca-Cola would withdraw 15 million crates of soda for sale and temporarily close 3 European facilities. With no clear cause of sickness, it's made clear that this was some sort of mass sociogenic illness, though to this day there isn't really a widely agreed on explanation for what could have caused this. In September of 2018, Emirates Flight 203 flew from Dubai to the JFK airport in New York City. On the flight, anywhere between 19 and 100 passengers and crew members suddenly fell ill, displaying flu symptoms. Those on the plane described a symphony of coughing, and at one point, so many people were rushing to the bathrooms that crew members had to close them. When they landed, they did so in the company of fire trucks, police, and health officials who screened everyone upon arrival. 3 passengers and 7 crew members were then taken to the hospital. So, did everyone have the flu? Well, if that's the case, they all would have had to catch it before getting on the flight. Much before, in fact. The flu's incubation period is at least a couple of days, not 14 hours, the length of Flight 203. It's extremely plausible that somehow mass hysteria was at play here. One person coughs, then another, until 100 people have somehow convinced themselves that they have the flu. It's quite horrifying how sick one can actually get from mass hysteria, and this entry shows how serious these sort of emergencies can be when they happen in sensitive locations like an airplane. The 2006 Mumbai sweet seawater incident was a strange situation where people in Mumbai suddenly reported that the water at Mahim Creek had turned very sweet. Hours later, citizens of Gujarat claimed that the water at Tithal Beach had turned sweet as well. People flocked to the water in droves to have a sip of it. Local health authorities worried there could have been a contamination from a waterborne illness like gastroenteritis and advised people not to drink it, who, by this point, were frantically collecting the water in bottles to take home. There isn't really an explanation to how the water became this sweet. No evidence of huge amounts of bacteria or disease were found, so could this have been mass hysteria? The only other explanation there is that the water tasted less sweet because of increased rainfall and recent monsoons pushing some of the salt water out and replacing it with fresh water, but even that shouldn't have made this many people notice a difference. Very strange. The Monkey Man of New Delhi, also known as Kala Bandar, was a made-up monster spotted in the city around 2001. This incident of mass hysteria gripped the community so tightly that around 2 or 3 people actually died jumping off buildings, allegedly because they thought they were being pursued by the monster. Police were so exhausted and out of answers to give to the public that they actually issued artist renditions of the monster in hopes that the people would see how crazy it was and realize it was fake. It unfortunately had the opposite effect. Many people reported this monkey man attacking them, and New Delhi police responded by having actual large-scale manhunts, which they were later criticized for because it only incited more panic and convinced more people that the monkey man was real. To this day, the monkey man was never caught, so we can likely chalk this up to the mass hysteria similar to Hammersmith Ghost or Spring Heeled Jack incidents. Or maybe there is just a monkey running around New Delhi attacking people, who knows? That's very possible. On September 14th, 2008, in Butembo, located in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, two rival football clubs, Sokozaki and the Nuki system, played an intense football game. When it became clear that the Nuki team was losing, many in the crowd thought that the goalkeeper had tried to cast a spell to turn the tide of the game. In response, a brawl broke out in the stands. When nearby police tried to intervene, they were pelted by rocks from the crowd. In retaliation, police shot tear gas into the crowd, which caused a panic and a mass flight from the stadium. Unfortunately, 13 people would be killed from suffocation and 36 more were injured. Of the 13 deaths, all but a few were children from the ages of 11 to 16 years old. This situation was as serious as it is because of high levels of belief and animism in the Congo, but also, more importantly, from the terrible judgment from the police forces who literally shot tear gas into a stadium full of kids. The province of Butembo is still located in an area subject to lots of violence, displacement, and unrest, and we can only hope that the nation is able to grow and improve training, especially for their police forces, so that something like this never happens again. I wouldn't consider this mass hysteria because it's a logical response to a terrible decision from the police, but this was still a horrible incident. The biting nun entry essentially refers to the same thing as the meowing nuns discussed earlier. There isn't much else to add here. The Blackburn faintings occurred on a day in 1965 in Blackburn, UK, when Princess Margaret had been invited to view a newly restored cathedral. Many people lined the streets to celebrate her arrival, especially many children. Suddenly, however, with no cause, upwards of 140 of these children began to faint. Initially, a medical spokesperson offered the explanation that since it was mid-morning, many of the children had been standing outside in the sun without breakfast for a while, which could have been a valid explanation if it weren't for another 98 children passing out at a girls' school elsewhere in the city. Doctors searched the school for biological explanations, but none could be found. To this day, this remains an incident of mostly unexplained mass hysteria. In Mount Pleasant, Mississippi, 1976, 15 students at a school collapsed and began to writhe about in pain. Police instantly suspected drug overdose from some shared substance, but no evidence of it was ever found. Rumors spread throughout the school that a curse had caused these students to collapse, and almost a third of the student body skipped class the next day. To this day, there's no explanation for this incidence of mass hysteria, though one hypothesis has to do with the fact that two of the girls that collapsed had a rivalry over a boy that had been increasing tension between their friend groups. Even if this caused some sort of stress, the fact that it caused 15 students to just collapse is insane. The Irish Fright was an event that occurred in 1688 throughout English communities in response to rumors that Irish mobs were burning down English towns and planning to massacre the English people. This outbreak of mass hysteria is defined by the rumors and fake news that were spread. There's a lot of historical background to the spread of these rumors that has to do with the Jacobite Irish Army and the mostly Protestant English, but regardless, it's a very interesting case and a good read overall. It has a lot of historical significance with respect to the conflict between the English and Irish. The Tanzania mass fainting incident happened in 2008 where 20 girls at the Ali Hassan Mwini School fainted during an exam. Oddly enough, it wasn't reported in any male students, only girls. Mr. Makungu, an education officer in the area, said that this wasn't the first local case of mass hysteria causing girls to faint. It had actually happened several times that month in the school. It wasn't documented well, but this is likely another incidence of high stress causing someone to faint and thus motivating more and more people to do so. It's certainly very strange. The 2007 Boston Moonlight Panic is quite literally one of the stupidest instances of mass hysteria I've ever heard of, but it's also really funny. So, for background, Moonlights are characters in the Adult Swim TV show Aqua Teen Hunger Force. In 2007, as part of a guerrilla marketing campaign for an Aqua Teen Hunger Force movie, many LED lights showing these characters were set up in Boston and surrounding cities. For some reason, Boston police mistook these for a bomb. They arrested 2 men who were setting up these lights, and after realizing that they weren't in fact improvised explosive devices, the Boston Police Department said in their defense that these signs had, quote, some characteristics associated with improvised explosive devices, of which included an identifiable power source, a circuit board with exposed wiring, and electrical tape. It's got to be the stupidest defense I've ever seen. Let's get this straight again. The police assumed that because this had a power source and some electrical tape, that it was probably a bomb. Okay then, alright, so this wasn't as much mass hysteria as it was just a mistake from the police and a huge media reaction, but honestly this is really funny. Face scratcher hysteria refers to an incident in Uttar Pradesh, India, in 2002, where a creature known as Munchuchawa, or face scratcher, attacked upwards of 100 people, or so it was reported. People were so afraid that the community established sleeping shifts so that people could watch the streets for the face scratcher. Others took apart their TVs, thinking the antenna would attract the monster. Now, if it weren't for what I'm about to describe, this would have gone down in history as just another instance of a fake monster, quote-unquote, attacking a community filled with stressed individuals, yada yada yada, but no. This entry goes much farther. Agitated for not being adequately protected from the face scratcher, a large mob gathered outside of a police station in town. They begun attacking the station, and police opened fire into the crowd to disperse it, killing 1 man and injuring several others. They begun attacking the station, and police opened fire into the crowd to disperse it, killing 1 man and injuring several others. Now, this instance shows how important it is for authorities to communicate with citizens when mass hysteria is suspected, because oftentimes the panic is more dangerous than any face-scratching beast. Puppy pregnancy syndrome is a psychosomatic illness localized in several villages in India. Most people who suffer from this illness have low access to education. Now, you're probably wondering what this disease does to you. Well, people who contract this illness believe that after they've been bitten by a dog, they get pregnant with puppies. And yes, this can occur in men and women. The men who experience this illness fully believe that they will have to give birth to the puppies through their penis. Victims begin to bark and feel puppies moving around in their abdomen. The disease can only be cured by local witch doctors, but oftentimes witch doctors discourage patients from seeing real accredited doctors as well. This is very problematic because people with this disease may actually contract rabies from the bite and then refuse to get treatment, which can lead to real consequences and inadvertently make the tail of this disease live on one way or another. In the summer of 1964, groups of people went hunting for leprechauns in Jubilee Park, Liverpool. Rumors of leprechauns started after schoolchildren reported seeing small men in the park throwing stones at one another. For some reason, the park became so filled with hunters who were tearing up flower beds and grass to look for leprechauns that the police had to clear out the park before it was completely destroyed. There weren't any theories about what caused this until 1982, when the Liverpool Echo ran a story about a man who claimed to have started the incident. Brian Jones, who lived in the area, was a short man who was out gardening one day when a couple of kids watched him from a short distance. When he heard one of them say, "It's a leprechaun," he decided to be funny, and he, quote, bounded into view, babbling made-up words, jumping up and down, and picked up turfs, throwing them at the children. We honestly have no idea if this story is true, but if it is, that's honestly hilarious. The Tanganyika laughter epidemic of 1962 refers to an outbreak of mass hysteria near the village of Kashasha in what is now Tanzania. At a girls' boarding school, uncontrollable laughter began in 3 girls, and it spread to 95 of the 159 students. The worst affected laughed uncontrollably for upwards of 16 days. With teachers unaffected, but certainly confused and unable to do their job, the school was closed for nearly 2 months. It actually spread to the nearby village of Nshamba, infecting another 217. Then, 48 girls in a middle school nearby caught the epidemic as well. The first school was sued by the second for spreading the epidemic, which would last 18 months until stopping just as quickly as it onset. Now, theories for why this happened all revolve around stress. It's important to note that the nation had just won its independence and students were subjected to higher expectations from their schools. Also, many of these were missionary schools run by strict elders, which also put pressure on many of the young students. The Mad Gasser of Mattoon was a nickname given to a person who allegedly attacked people in their homes using gas in Mattoon, Illinois, around 1944. Within 2 weeks, over 24 cases were reported to the police, and many people thought they spotted this alleged attacker from a distance. This began in 1944 when women in the town began to feel sick, one woman even feeling paralyzed in her bed. More and more people started to feel this way, but when they did, they would also claim to smell strong odors. The first ever confirmed attack happened on September 1st when a woman claimed that she saw someone trying to get in through her window, though this was later argued to have just been a robber. But it began to spiral from there. People reported seeing a prowler who would disperse gas that would paralyze them. Even the FBI got involved, but neither they nor the police could find any physical evidence of this gasser. Eventually, the police just came out and said they couldn't give priority to these calls anymore because they believed it was just fear and anxiety based. Their explanation was that this stress occurred from the high number of men who were away from home in the service at the time. After this announcement, the reports mostly stopped. There are a couple of theories to explain this. The first, and least likely, is that there actually was a mad gasser and he just managed to evade both the FBI and local authorities. The second was that there was some industrial pollution in the area, but then again, that would be unlikely to affect people in any way. The third, final, and most likely theory is that this is a case of mass hysteria caused by stress. The daycare sex abuse entry essentially refers to the circumstances that started the satanic panic, which I covered a bit earlier. There isn't much else to add here, but I will link some resources for further reading for anyone interested. Gravida de Taubate, or pregnant from Taubate, refers to a woman from Taubate, Brazil who faked a quadruplet pregnancy. She appeared on various TV shows showing off her rare pregnancy, and many people donated money or baby supplies to her. They would be enraged to find out that she faked the pregnancy. She and her husband in the end were actually prosecuted for embezzlement, but it didn't go very far and didn't have a huge impact on her end. I'm not quite sure why this is on here so low, but it is interesting one way or another. The Hollandwell incident refers to an around 300 unexplained faintings at the Hollandwell Showground in Nottinghamshire, England. All of the victims were children at the showground, which, that day in July 1980, was hosting a band competition. Now, as you can imagine, this was in the summer and many children had been traveling, so you might expect some collapses from exhaustion or dehydration, but certainly not 300 of them. This happened around 10:30, about an hour and a half after everyone showed up, and it literally looked contagious. Band members would just fall, and after they did, 3 of their peers would follow suit. In the end, 259 children were taken to the hospital. 9 would stay the night there. The cause of this is unknown, but there are currently 2 prevailing theories, the first being that the pesticide tridmorph, which had been used in the area, caused the children to collapse. This seems like the easy way out, as opposed to acknowledging the second explanation, which is that this was a case of mass hysteria. Vanishing genitalia epidemic, also called Koro, is a cultural bound disorder where one believes that their penis is shrinking. The word Koro comes from the Malay word for the head of a tortoise, as people suffering from this disease think that their genitals are retracting in the same way that a tortoise does. Interestingly, this disease is actually recognized in the DSM-5, or the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. This manual is used to diagnose mental illnesses, so it's a big deal that this condition has landed a spot in the book. This disease isn't completely understood, but personality and psychological conflicts may have a hand in its onset. It's connected to mass hysteria because groups of people may feel the symptoms at one time, even though people with this condition never actually experience any shrinking. This is incredibly strange, but very prevalent throughout many different cultures in the world. Dot syndrome is a condition found in various South Asian cultures that has to do with men feeling negatively about various sexual issues. It's very much tied to Hindu culture and is more of a cultural bound disorder than actual mass hysteria. Post-1864 Danish germophobia refers to the situation in Denmark after the Second Schleswig War, which was a conflict between Denmark and the combined forces of Prussia and Austria. Now, this is a very long story short, but this war was fought over land disputes in Schleswig, Holstein, and Lauenburg, which Denmark was actually forced to secede to the Prussians and Austrians. This war is generally considered national trauma for Denmark and had huge effects on their future. One of the biggest hardships that came out of this war was that Danes living in ceded lands were forced to fight for the Germans in World War I. As you can imagine, this caused a lot of German resentment in Denmark. The writing tremor epidemic refers to two incidents in 1892 and 1904 which were eerily similar. These incidents took place in Grobtins, Poland, and later in Basel, Switzerland. In the first instance, a girl who was writing in class noticed her right hand start to tremble, and eventually these trembles spread to her entire body, eventually becoming a full-on seizure. This spread to 19 students in her class. In the latter incident, 27 students suffered from essentially the same case of mass hysteria. While it's true that psychological non-epileptic seizures are a reported and documented phenomenon, this is still very, very strange. The Kosovo student poisoning refers to the alleged poisoning of thousands of young people in 1990 via poison gas. Upwards of 7,241 were affected by this, and symptoms of the alleged poisoning included fainting, vomiting, and convulsing. Now, as you can imagine, this wasn't actually due to poison gas and was in fact an incidence of mass hysteria. Just that year, the Serbian government had decided to segregate schools in Kosovo. It's likely that the stress affecting students after this terrible decision was what caused this mysterious illness. To date, scientists haven't been able to find any biological causes. This is a pretty recent example with a huge number of people affected, but it again goes to show how political decisions can create mass hysteria. Kettara, Malaysia, 2019 Screaming Schoolgirls refers to an incident of mass hysteria where 39 schoolgirls went through a chain reaction of screaming fits. But this wasn't just your run-of-the-mill mass hysteria. These girls were also plagued by horrible visions. One girl's account reads as this: "The assembly bells rang. I was at my desk feeling sleepy when I felt a hard, sharp tap on my shoulder. I turned around to see who it was, and the room went dark. Fear overtook me. I felt a sharp, splitting pain in my back, and my head started spinning. I fell to the floor. Before I knew it, I was looking into the other world. Scenes of blood, gore, and violence. The scariest thing I saw was a face of pure evil. It was haunting me. I couldn't escape. I opened my mouth and tried to scream, but no sound came out. I passed out." This is insanely creepy. And one thing to mention is that Malaysia has had a great share of outbreaks of mass hysteria, starting in the 1960s amongst factory workers. But being in the scenario of that girl is just crazy to think about. The Louisiana twitching epidemic of 1939 was an incident of mass hysteria caused by a girl who twitched her leg to get out of dance class. She feared that her boyfriend would see how bad of a dancer she was and would break up with her. Yeah, you did hear that properly. Now, while it did work and got her out of class, it had the unfortunate effect of spreading to other girls, who all began to twitch uncontrollably. A paper written on mass hysteria used this as an example that romantic tension can cause mass hysteria in girls. And if this could be properly documented and studied further, it would be a very interesting conclusion. The Leroy, New York Tourette's outbreak occurred in October of 2011 when Katie Krautwurst, a high school student in the small town, woke up from a nap uncontrollably bobbing her neck forward and backward. Not only that, but her face was twitching and her arms jerked. Over the next few weeks, 18 more girls from the school would begin experiencing tics as well. From these movements to uncontrollable sounds, the girls all exhibited symptoms of Tourette's. Now, Tourette's is obviously not transmissible, and the girls were all eventually diagnosed with conversion disorder, which is a condition where one displays neurological symptoms like paralysis or Tourette's, for example, for no reason whatsoever. At the time, the diagnosis and situation surrounding these girls was very controversial and remains one of the most well-known modern cases of mass hysteria in the United States. The Seattle windshield pitting epidemic is a really cool entry. This instance of mass hysteria happened in 1954 when citizens of Seattle and surrounding communities began to notice, en masse, small dings and dents on their windshields. It started in the community of Bellingham when multiple citizens reported the dings on their windshields. Police originally thought it was the work of young vandals with BB guns, though once the story got published, the epidemic of windshield cracks grew more and more. Police in Bellingham literally set up a roadblock on a bridge, examining each car that would pass into town looking for people that might be suspicious, but they couldn't find anything. These reports grew to the thousands, and people were making crazy theories, from sand flea eggs in the glass to nuclear bomb tests sending shrapnel through the windshields. Eventually, police had to rule out vandalism because there were just too many reports for it to be that. Eventually, police ruled out vandalism because there were simply too many reports for any one kid to be doing. This event is widely understood to have been an incidence of mass delusion, but we don't even know if the original cases were vandalism or if they too were just hysteria. The Ganesha milk drinking miracle was a phenomenon that occurred on September 21st, 1995, when statues of the Hindi deity Ganesha were thought to be drinking milk. This began at a temple in New Delhi, where a man held milk to the statue, and according to him, it disappeared as if the statue drank it. Word quickly spread, and people all over the world began to replicate this, with some success. By noon, it had become international news, so people were packing Hindu temples believing that a miracle was occurring. So, was it? Not really. Many statues were not drinking the milk. Of the ones that were, one explanation offered was that when one would hold a spoonful of milk up to the statue, capillary action would cause it to run down the statue below the spoon so you couldn't see it. This sounds really obvious, and it's weird that someone wouldn't notice this, but it goes to show that sometimes people will see what they want to see. By the end of that day, once explanations had been made, most reports of the milk drinking stopped. The Starehe Girls Center in Kenya was a girls' center that had to isolate 52 students after an incident of mass hysteria occurred on October 1st, 2019. All these girls exhibited coughs, sneezing, and fevers for no apparent reason. The girls were given tests for common illnesses, and while it was found that 2 of them had rhinovirus, the rest were absolutely free from any biological illness. And now, for the most destructive, most horrifying form of mass hysteria yet: dogs living with cats. Okay, though, for real, you guys, thank you so much for watching this video. This has been the coolest and biggest project I've done yet, and it's taken a while to make, so I hope you enjoyed this. I really want to see some feedback in the comments to see if you enjoy content like this, and if you do, you're in luck because there's plenty more where this came from. I encourage you to subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this, and I hope you drop a like if you enjoyed the video as well. Thanks again to the creator of this iceberg, Walrus64. Have a great night, everyone, and see you soon.